So dear beloved Sangha, it's such a joy to be together with all of you this evening. Today is the 11th of October in the year 2020, and that's something to celebrate. We've all made it to this day. Over this past weekend, we've been celebrating our teacher Tay's continuation day. We had two groups come up on Saturday. We had an opportunity to share our recollections of being in the presence of such a wonderful teacher through Saturday. And then also today, we had the opportunity to sit together, to share, to walk for Tay, and to build our brotherhood and sisterhood. It was really a beautiful and heart-opening opportunity. And so for me, as for many of us who are watching this talk at the moment, we're sitting in the Southern Hemisphere where spring has come finally and fully. For me, as many of you know, due to the way that I've been traveling before the pandemic hit, I've been living in a seemingly endless winter. So now the flowers are blooming, light is returning, and the cicadas are humming here at Mountain Spring Monastery. Spring has come. And in the middle of this spring, I received a message a few days ago, a week or so ago, from a young friend who was thinking that the world would be a better place without them. In Buddhism, there's a metaphor of a raging stream, more of a torrent, really. And when I think of this torrent, I remember many years ago when the brothers went on their first canoeing outing, the brothers in Plum Village. We were canoeing down the river, and the brother who was in the canoe with me said, "Brother Phapai, lay down and take a rest. Let me row for a while." So I lay down and I napped. And a few minutes later, suddenly our canoe was caught in some rapids and I was flung out of the boat. I was disoriented, and being disoriented, I didn't know which way was up and which way was down anymore. And instinctively, I began thrashing around. After thrashing around for a while and becoming increasingly desperate for air, I realized that the first thing I needed to do was to stop struggling against myself. To try to relax right in the middle of that whirlpool and to let the stream be the stream. This was hard. It was the last thing that I wanted to do, but it was the only thing I could do in that moment. And that way, I might be able to figure out what I needed to do. So I did that. I let my body go limp. And a few seconds later, I broke the surface. Letting our bodies go limp in the middle of a whirlpool outside, but also a whirlpool inside, is the last thing, the very last thing we feel like doing. But this is not the same as surrender. It's a choice to understand, to gain clarity, and to take some meaningful action in order to be able to take a breath. For many of us, just the possibility to be able to take a breath, to be able to rest for even a moment, can seem like an incredible luxury when it seems like the whirlpool, the raging torrent of individual and collective dukkha, pain, anger, violence, discrimination, self-hatred, and shame are present everywhere. Many of us are tired. Some of us are dead tired. So many of us have internalized this dukkha, this war. And so many of our community, especially our young people, think that the world might be at a better place without them in it. Rather than being a surrender or a passive acceptance, letting our body go limp in the middle of the raging torrent inside and outside is to give up the fight against ourselves or internalizing the messages that we receive from others. and to acknowledge our capacity to kick out and to swim forward in the direction that the insight that we all carry in our body leads us to want to go. And that's a radical act. That's a radical act of self-love, a radical act of you saying to yourself, I love you, I'm here for you, I can do this. I can take another step. Because there are many moments, too many moments to count, in which it might seem that it's not possible to take another step. But then you do. And then you take another one and another one. Because that's what a practitioner does. That's what a warrior does. That's what a hero does. And anyone who embarks on the path of practice is a hero. In Buddhism, we speak of this raging torrent within and around that is flowing in one direction, and that our job as practitioners, in a sense, is to swim against that stream, against that current. We're invited to swim against the stream. In fact, in some way, it's our place of real work, our place of insight and healing, and also, in a sense, it's a place of power. Most of the time, to engage in this real work of looking at our habit energies, of trying a different way, can be challenging. There are times that it's painful. There are times that it can be heartbreaking, but at the same time is filled with joy. Sometimes there can even be the question, especially when we see a lot of discrimination, a lot of hatred, a lot of anger directed towards us, of why we need to be the ones to do the majority of the healing work, or who appear to do the majority of the healing work. Why don't others do some of the work from time to time? Healing's hard. Letting the stream be the stream and keeping swimming against the current, and hopefully from time to time finding a rock pool where we can tread water for a few breaths. We can engage in this as a kind of war, thrashing about, but we're just going to tire ourselves out and we won't get that far. Or we can soften our body, our heart, and relentlessly keep moving forward. Lately, I've been thinking that if there's one word in the English language that I would choose to describe a meditator, it's relentless. The definition of relentless is continuing in a determined way without interruption. That's really the heart of the practice, isn't it? To continue in a determined way without interruption. In fact, our teacher Thay used to describe our practice using a Vietnamese phrase, Mien Mok. It means continuous. In 2020, I've started to use the word relentless, continuing in a determined way, in a way full of aspiration and direction, without any interruption. To be a relentless practitioner means not to settle for what other people tell you or what you tell yourself. Because I think what we tell ourselves is often a lot more. Those messages are often a lot more than the messages we receive from others. To be continually exploring new aspects of ourselves and of life, of moving forward, of not getting stuck in a rut. And this is the very definition of courage, the very definition of relentless. This is getting real. This is being relentless. I will not give up. I won't betray myself into small comforts, mistaking them for real security. I'm willing to question all of my assumptions and beliefs, the ways I do things, and the things I hold dear, being willing to set out on, to embark on, and remain on for the whole of our lives, this journey of discovery of what the world is, of what we are, and what our real situation is. It means not to run away, even when we discover truths about ourselves or about the world that are inconvenient. Inconvenient because those discoveries might be against the stream of what this round of dukkha, this round of samsara tells us, or society tells us should be the norm. But being willing to show up for what is there, regardless of what it is. It's the very foundation of meditation practice. It's the very basis of a meaningful spiritual life. To me, a real spiritual life is a continual practice of exploring who we really are, and also being absolutely authentic to that discovery. This is not easy, but again, it's incredibly joyful. The practice of meditation has so many fruits, but one of the most important is that as we develop this capacity for showing up for the breath, showing up for a step, for an emotion, for another person, for the world, or for this ever-changing experience that we call ourselves, we learn not to be afraid anymore. Because any meaningful discovery, any real insight will hopefully shake our preconceptions. If an insight arises and we have a feeling like, oh yeah, I knew that already, it's probably not an insight that's going to bring us to the other shore. Let's have a sound of the bell. So dear family, we're continuing on this week with the second in the series of talks on the beautiful text, the Thagavagga, the Book of Eights, which is in the Sutta Nipata of the Pali Canon. And this week we continue on looking at the second poem. The second poem in the Book of Eights, it continues with the theme of desire, of karma, which was explored in the first poem. But it brings in a few different aspects to this exploration of desire, of karma. Most particularly, there's a shift in the focus in this second poem from an external focus on sense impressions, which we explored 2 weeks ago, to the subtle and profound process of becoming, the process of becoming and the process of, I guess we could say, dissolution, of when things are changing into other forms. So let's hear the poem in its entirety, and then we'll have a brief look at each of the verses. Staying attached to the cave, their hiding place, heavily covered over, a person sunk in confusion is far from seclusion. For sensual pleasures, sensual desires in the world are not let go of lightly. Those chained by desire, bound by the allure of becoming, aren't easily released, for there's no liberation by others. Intent, in front or behind, on hunger for sensual pleasures, here or before, greedy for sensual pleasures, busy, deluded, ungenerous, entrenched in an out-of-tune way, They, impelled into pain, lament, "What will we be when we pass on from here?" Therefore, you should train right here. Don't do what you know is out of harmony in the world. Life is short, say the wise. I see people thrashing about in the world, thirsting for states of existence, not freed from craving for becoming and non-becoming. Lowly people weep in the face of death. See them thrashing about in their selfishness, like fish in tiny puddles of a dying stream. Observing this, live unselfishly, not forming attachments to becoming, no longer longing towards either extreme. Having understood touch, the contact of sense experience, together with letting go, one should do what others will praise and not blame. A wise one is not stained by what is seen and heard. The sage has known perception and crossed the flood. So with nothing tainted, nothing wrapped around, they fare on in diligence with the arrow drawn, neither longing for this world nor for another. So I hope you're sharing my delight with this text that we're working through. It's very direct and at the same time incredibly profound. This poem's explanation or framework of looking at desire is to look at desire as something to be recognized and transformed. And a desire is emphasized by use of various synonyms for desire in this text: hunger, thirst, greed, and attachment, and so on. So perhaps we can have a look through verse by verse. So the first section is staying attached to the cave, their hiding place, heavily covered over. A person sunk in confusion is far from seclusion. For sensual pleasures, sensual desires in the world are not let go of lightly. So in this first section, this first stanza, the Buddha offers a contrast between hiding and seclusion. If we're a young practitioner, then there can be a tendency to want to run away from external things that we think cause us suffering. In some ways, actually, this could be a great step because we're making a choice to care for ourselves. But it can only ever be a first step, an initial step, as we've reflected on in earlier talks. We need to bring our practice out of the cave, right into the heart of our lives, just as they are, and just as we are. The act of physically or mentally removing ourselves, of running away from sense impressions, or the temptations of the world, or suffering or pain, is not a long-term solution at all. Since in itself, as we've explored before, it can be a form of craving or a form of ill will or a manifestation of our individual or collective delusion or confusion. There's actually a term in the modern world that's used to describe one aspect of this tendency, and that is spiritual bypassing. Spiritual bypassing is a subtle and yet quite highly evolved form of avoidance, the holier than thou mentality. For transformation to be real, for our spiritual practice to be effective, it has to be found right in the heart of our lives. It needs to be rooted right in the heart of our lives, as our teacher Tay has emphasized in every single talk he has ever given. I remember years ago when I was practicing in a meditation tradition. I have so much appreciation for my time in that Buddhist tradition. At one point, though, I was in conversation with another practitioner, and that practitioner mentioned, "Oh, I never go to town anymore because I'm overwhelmed with sense impressions. I can only stay in the forest." So I thought to myself that while that was wonderful, it was also a kind of conditioned experience based on causes and conditions, that with that situation, that person was really dependent on a particular environment. And if that environment wasn't around them, then everything just went to pieces. So that sharing from that practitioner actually led me to the path that brought me to Plum Village, to engage practice. So I'm really grateful for that. Seclusion, viveka, as we explored in the last poem, on the other hand, is touched on here again and is quite different from isolation, from separating ourselves out in some way. Since if we've touched the reality of interbeing, we know that it's actually not possible to isolate. We constantly inter-are. And one of the basic, the most fundamental insights of Buddhism is that this is because that is, and this is not because that is not. On an even more subtle level, viveka refers to kind of the transformation of this thirst, this desire that manifests when we begin to understand some of aspects of the way things really are, the things that we cling onto. We cling onto our sense impressions and our concepts. Covered heavily over in this stanza means covered over heavily with unskillful mental qualities. I'm also reminded every time I read this phrase of covered heavily over, of our basic orientation in Buddhism and in Buddhist practice, that our practice, our meditation practice, is to uncover the innate goodness, the innate beauty, and the innate insight that has been there within us, within you, from the very beginning. Sensual desires and sensual pleasures in this line. The original word, of course, in Pali is kama, which we explored in the last talk. And these two aspects of kama are both covered in this verse, both as sensual desire itself and sensual pleasures. So in the second stanza, we read, "Those chained by desire, bound by the allure of becoming, aren't easily released, for there's no liberation by others." Even though most of the time we tend to think of chasing after our desires as freedom to do what I want, when I want, how I want, it's not really a freedom at all. Since in a way, it contributes to this endless internal and external cycle that we call samsara. Samsara, as I've shared before, is not only an external thing, but it's a chronic inner and outer situation of repeated dissatisfaction that we constantly co-create due to our lack of seeing things clearly. The tendency to want to become something, anything other than what we think we are now, happy, peaceful, rich, loved, is so alluring. But the problem is that it's like salt water. No matter how much you drink, you're going to want more. The original word that we translate as becoming in Pali is bhava, derived from the root bu, which means to become. It is sometimes translated as existence. And abhava, the opposite of bhava, can be translated as non-existent. But I myself find that becoming is more helpful for me in my practice. And then we read a very powerful line in this verse, which is, there is no liberation by others. Among the last recorded words of the Buddha was the phrase, liberate yourself with diligence. And this again is a reminder of our own capacity. I really do think, and if there's one thing I want to drill into everyone's consciousness, the seed that I want to continually water in everybody, it is that each one of us has the capacity to wake up. We can do this. If there's a way in this life for you to completely acknowledge your own capacity, to acknowledge your own capacity to yourself once and for all, then that would be the beginning point of an amazing transformation. So this sentence, there's no liberation by others, continues on from the earlier theme of seclusion, and then it actually continues it further. On the one hand, it's a reminder that it's we ourselves who need to see our situation and to make steps forward, and that the wise ones, the Buddhas, our great teachers and so on, can only point the way, but we need to walk it ourselves. We need to actually take steps on that path, to actually apply the teachings as best we can in our situation. On the other hand, it's also a reminder that you don't need one more thing. You are enough, more than enough. Nothing outside ourselves can give us what we think we need, since we've had it all along. There's no liberation by others. Others here is not only other people or Buddhas or great spiritual teachers or divine beings and so on. It's also speaking about an other, something other than within ourselves. So it's always been our birthright. What will it take for us? What will it take for all of us to acknowledge that and then to move forward? Intense, in front or behind, on hunger for sensual pleasures, here or before, greedy for sensual pleasures, busy, deluded, ungenerous, entrenched in an out of tune way. They, impelled into pain, lament, what will we be when we pass from here? In front and behind mean in the past or in the future. In this line, we see a reflection of a teaching that's expanded later in such beautiful discourses as Knowing the Better Way to Live Alone, the Bodhicarata Sutta, and other related sutras on our tendency to pursue the past, to pursue the future, and to be swept away by the present. I recommend that text for everybody to read this week, the discourse on Knowing the Better Way to Live Alone. Perhaps along with another discourse that goes very well together with it, the Elder Discourse. Both of these can be found in the Plum Village Chanting and Recitation book, Chanting from the Heart. We see another word in this verse that really shouts out to us, and that's the word busy. So it literally means caught up in doing, in thinking that there's something to be done, being pulled here and there outside of ourselves. In the discourse on the 8 realizations of great beings, which, as everybody knows, I love dearly, we read, there are those who are able to relax, their bodies and minds free from entanglement. In Zen and in the Plum Village practice, we emphasize the spirit of Master Rinzai, Master Linqi, of being a businessless person, of not getting caught up in doing anymore. of not letting our practice become another thing that we do, but rather an expression of our inner being. And then we see the word entrenched. And I love this translation. In my own practice, I've used the phrase tracks in the carpet, but entrenchment is an even more evocative image, a more evocative translation. I find it to be very helpful of being so deep down in our comfort zones that we can no longer see anything else anymore. Just like the trenches in the First World War, can't see over the top. Maybe you can see just a little bit of sky. This week, it might be helpful for each of us to contemplate where am I entrenched in my thoughts, in my actions, and so on. And see if we can identify some of those areas of entrenchment and how they came to be. Let's have a sound of the bell. And then we read a phrase, the out of tune way. A while back, a few months ago now, when we were exploring together the 7 factors of awakening, I shared about adjusting the pitch of our practice in each moment and about the Buddha's beautiful teaching to Venerable Sona in the Anguttara Nikaya, which feels appropriate here again and shows us how the Buddha taught in a way that was appropriate for each person. So the sutra goes, as Venerable Sona was meditating in seclusion, after doing walking meditation until the skin of the soles of his feet was split and bleeding, he began thinking of the Blessed One's disciples who are persistent. I am one, but my mind is not yet free. What if I would return to everyday life and enjoy wealth and make merit? Then the Buddha, as soon as he understood Venerable Sona's train of thinking, came to Venerable Sona and sat down on a seat nearby. And Venerable Sona, after paying respect to the Buddha, sat to one side. And then the Buddha said, just now as you were meditating, didn't you think that your mind is not released? What if you should return to everyday life and enjoy wealth and make merit? And Venerable Sona said, yes. And so the Buddha said, so what about this, Sona? When you were a householder, were you a skilled musician playing the stringed instrument? And Venerable Sona said, yes, I was. Then the Buddha says, and so what do you think when the strings of your instrument were too tight? Was your instrument in tune and playable? Well, of course not. And so what do you think when the strings of your instrument were too loose? Was your instrument in tune and playable? No, it wasn't. And what do you think when the strings of your instrument were neither too tight or too loose, but tuned to be right on pitch? Was your instrument in tune and playable? Yes. In the same way, Sona, you should determine the right pitch for your practice. Attune the pitch of your faculties to that pitch. And from there, pick up your theme. Yes, I will do that, Venerable Sona answered the Buddha. So right after that, Venerable Sona determined the right pitch for his practice, attuned the pitch of his faculties to that, and there picked up his theme. Practicing wholeheartedly, he in no time reached and remained in the supreme goal. You can find the longer form of the text in the Anguttara Nikaya, chapter 6, number 55. So here in the current text, in addition to the above, being out of tune means being caught up in the 10 types of unskillful action I don't know about you, but those of us who are list lovers, it's time to rejoice. It's time to be very happy, because even though there are no lists in the Book of Eights, in the Atthagavagga, like I said last week, I couldn't resist the chance to offer a list, just for those of you who love lists as much as I do. Speaking of the 10 types of unskillful action, the Buddha shared that there are 3 ways in which we can have unskillful bodily action, 4 ways in which we can have unskillful verbal action, and 3 ways in which we can have unskillful mental action. So, unskillful bodily action. These are the 3 unwholesome bodily actions. There's the case where a person takes the life of another living being. There's the case where a person takes what's not freely given to them. And there's the case in which a person engages in sexuality in a way that harms themselves or harms others. And then with unskillful verbal action, there's false speech, divisive speech, speech that's intended to break apart and divide, abusive speech. And then the final one, which is quite beautiful, somebody who speaks out of season with words that are not worth treasuring. And then unskillful mental action, being unsatisfied and greedy, carrying ill will, and having wrong view or being warped in the way that we see things. So these are the 10 bases of unskillful action. If a person carries within them the 10 bases of unskillful action, then it's said in the text that even if we get up at the proper time from our bed and we touch the earth and do all of the required external practices, that they have no meaning. And so in this text, which you can find in the Anguttara Nikaya, chapter 10, sutra number 176, we discover that everything needs to come from within. We need to focus our practice on practices that actually transform our situation, and to not just focus on meaningless externals, that our real practice is the work of transformation. So it continues on in this poem, therefore we should train right here. Don't do what you know is out of harmony in the world. Life is short, say the wise. So to train right here, basically this text is reminding us, what are we waiting for? What kind of conditions are we waiting for? And actually to begin this path of practice, to begin looking at that thing we haven't wanted to look at, or to cultivate those qualities that we want to cultivate. There's that old Zen story of a student coming to a teacher and asking where their path is, and then the teacher drawing a line in the sand right at the feet of the person who asked that question. So for me, when I read this line, I think of the Australian expression, pull up your socks. This is kind of like the ancient way, I feel, of saying, pull up your socks and get to work with what we have. There's no perfect moment, that this is the very moment, right where we are. And when I use the word work, please remember what Tay shared with us, that it's not hard labor. Spiritual work is very different to hard labor. It shouldn't be a struggle in the usual sense. It should be a delight, something that's enjoyable. It becomes a delight to let go of something that when we realize that it causes us pain. So when we use the word work, please don't think that we're talking about buckling down, sweating bullets and suffering. This is not the correct way to practice. In fact, our practice needs to be beautiful in the beginning, the middle, and the end, an absolute delight. In Plum Village tradition, we have this verse that we wake up with each morning, 24 brand new hours. In fact, we're not guaranteed 24 hours. One of these days, perhaps very soon, we'll wake up one morning and it'll be our last day. So when we see that line, life is short, say the wise, it's a reminder that the time that we think we have to practice to open our heart, to forgive ourselves, to forgive the other person, to do the transformative work that we want to do, it's not guaranteed. So let's do our best each day. This understanding that one of these days, perhaps soon, perhaps today, it might be our last, can be very sad, or it can actually be very beautiful and a wonderful invitation. There's a meditation on death that I myself have found very powerful, very transformative. And it consists of 9 aspects, which I've written about before. The first is to contemplate that death is certain. Under this topic, there are 3 things to contemplate, and I found it very helpful. That no one has ever escaped death. There's no person, no animal, no insect, no living being that's escaped death. And so we contemplate that and we reflect within our own bodies, our experience. Is that something that anybody's ever escaped? No. And then secondly, my death is coming closer each and every moment. So we contemplate and we realize that in fact, with each moment that goes by, we're coming closer to this moment of transformation. We're coming closer to this moment of death. As we get older, I like to joke with people, you're getting older when people stop asking, how are you? And they ask you, are you doing okay? Are you all right? Rather than, how are you? So when somebody does ask me that, it's a great reminder to practice reflecting on my death is coming closer each and every moment. And so this could be something that's really waters a lot of fear in us, for sure. But it can also water a sense of the preciousness of this moment, the preciousness of being alive, the preciousness of having this day of being here. What a gift. And then the third meditation under this first area is, so if I understand these things, if I understand that there hasn't yet been anybody who's ever not died, and that my own death is coming closer each and every moment, the third aspect is, so therefore, what am I waiting for? What am I waiting for? And then the second aspect of this meditation is that the time of our death is not known to us. And then to kind of contemplate that not everybody has the same lifespan. We hear often about there being an average lifespan of, 80 years or something like that. It's a little different depending on each country and depending on genders and also socioeconomic class and so on. So let's just say for the sake of this, about 80 years. And we have this assumption that, okay, I'll have 80 years at least, or 90 years, or 100 years. But we don't all have the same lifespan. That's the first contemplation, to kind of reflect on everybody, all the categories of humans and things, and consider that everybody has different moments of death, even ourselves. And then the second aspect of this meditation is to consider all the different conditions which endanger our life. That there are, at any moment, there are any number of things that can happen. We've certainly had this awareness be brought home to us over the last 6 or 7 months. And then third, that our body is quite fragile. It can appear quite strong, but in fact, the fact that we have a body in good condition and everything, it's actually a fragile and miraculous and wonderful thing. And then the third aspect of this meditation is to reflect on the aspect at the time of my death, will the following things be useful to me? My possessions, my money, my status, and my opinions? Or will my friends or my body, will those things be useful for me at that moment? And then to kind of ask ourselves and to look into what will be useful. So this meditation I've found to be very helpful on reflecting on different aspects of death. And death, as we've understood in earlier talks, is not something that happens only once, but is happening to us in each and every moment in so many different levels. So the poem continues on, I see people thrashing about in the world, thirsting for states of existence, not freed from craving, becoming, and non-becoming. So throughout this text, there's the repeated framework that this sense of clinging, this sense of holding on to something, it's caused by craving. And that craving, that continual sense of lack, that continual search for something is arising out of ignorance, arising out of not seeing our situation and the situation of the thing that we're running after clearly. And that as a practitioner, our practice is to let go, to leave behind the tendency to build a foundation of transforming our tendency towards becoming or getting rid of something. So most of us will be aware of the teaching of interdependent co-arising, and will notice that these three factors in this order form a part of that larger teaching. The fact that clinging is caused by this sense of lack, this sense of craving, and that it all arises out of ignorance, of not seeing things clearly. And we mentioned this in the talk on the development of right view, right understanding as the first factor, and the continuing factor of the Noble Eightfold Path. In fact, in the series on the Four Noble Truths, I shared the point that jati, birth, refers not only to physical birth, and that death doesn't refer only to physical death, but to each and every arising and passing away in each moment, on all levels, thoughts, words, actions, and so on. These are called states of becoming. And we cling to them madly. In fact, when we cling, what we actually cling onto are our perceptions and our concepts about things, not really the things themselves. And this is a really important point to contemplate, that we cling to our perceptions and notions about things, not actually the things themselves. Then the poem continues on, lowly people weep in the face of death. See them thrashing around in their selfishness, like fish in tiny puddles of a drying stream. Observing this, live unselfishly, not forming attachments to becoming, no longer longing towards either extreme. Lowly here is not a person considered lowly because of birth, but a lowly person is a person who doesn't see clearly, especially not seeing the impermanent nature of everything, that everything is subject to birth and is dying in each and every moment, thrashing about. So in the context of this verse, in this poem, those of us who are caught up in this thirst for becoming or non-becoming, for existence or non-existence, are described as thrashing about, which is an idea that is followed by a powerful metaphor of fish flailing around in shallow water. This sense of there's no real relief here, this sense of being lulled into a false sense of security. There's a little bit of water for the fish to swim around in, to thrash around in at this moment in time, but it's rapidly drying up. It won't be there forever. So this shallow and rapidly drying up water that people struggle in is called selfishness in the text, but it actually refers to our constant tendency towards selfing, to make it all about us, our concepts of what is me or mine. Even to the point of looking at the way we view our spiritual path, my spiritual path, my transformation, my peace. This wonderful text, the Book of Eights, keeps reminding us to look at what we keep clinging to on all levels. And that the way we mistake it for real security when it's anything but that. We walk our path as it opens itself to us in each moment. But we don't get caught up in too many ideas or concepts about it. If we do that, then rather than being a radical process of transformation, it can be a manufactured idea. So according to the commentary, either extremes here, it has several possible meanings: past and future, name and form, sense objects and sense impressions, self, non-self, or states of becoming and not becoming. But most importantly, rather than getting caught up in those concepts, most importantly, it's a reminder to each of us that Buddhism is always centered on the middle way, on the path right down the middle between extremes. Let's have a sound of the bell. So the verse continues on, having understood the contact, having understood touch, the contact of sense experience, together with letting go. One should do what others will praise and not blame. A wise one is not stained by what is seen and heard. The sage has known perception and has crossed the flood. So with nothing tainted, nothing wrapped around, they fare on in diligence with the arrow removed, neither longing for this world nor for another. So the last two verses are the first in the text that describe the qualities of a person who has experienced what we call liberation. This person in the text, in the Book of Eights, is called a wise one, a muni or a sage. So having understood touch, the contact of sense experience, together with letting go. I love that this line is a reminder that we each need to understand from within the depths of our own experience and not from reading or thinking. Understanding here and in the context of these teachings in general is so different from intellectual knowledge. So understand what? Understand that cycle of touch, of searching or craving, of clinging, and then becoming on a moment-by-moment basis. Understanding touch, in Pali, it's phassa, or sensory contact has three aspects: being able to identify and distinguish the different types of sensory contact. So firstly, becoming sensitive to sounds, to sensations, to tastes, to smells, and so on. And then recognizing pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. And then contemplating the true nature of sensory contact. So we begin to notice that with a fragrance, for example, it doesn't remain the same the whole time. It's continually in the process of change. Or a sound, it's the same, and so on. We might notice that we're pulled after certain sounds or smells or tastes or touches. Then after a while they change. This something that's pleasant might become unpleasant. For example, let's say you like chocolate. Maybe the first 2 or 3 mouthfuls are extremely pleasant. Then the 4th, 5th, 6th are okay. Then the 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th are not as enjoyable. And then we get to mouthful number 26 and you couldn't take another mouthful. To take another mouthful would be the most suffering that you could even think of in that moment. You just wouldn't want to take it. So this is an example, of a very simple example of how something that's pleasant can become unpleasant. Something that is extremely delightful can become dukkha, unsatisfactory. And then the fact that the other aspect is that it is it inter-is with everything else. It doesn't have a separate self. It doesn't have a separate independent existence. That's the third way to contemplate. So we contemplate that things are always in a process of change. And that means to notice how a sound keeps changing, how a smell keeps changing, how a taste keeps changing, how a thought keeps changing. We notice the nature of dukkha, the unsatisfactory nature of things. And we notice that nothing is by itself alone, that everything inter-is with other things. And through seeing clearly the nature of this cycle, it becomes the most natural thing in the world. Again, not hard work at all, to want to leave it behind without any nostalgia. So the same three aspects, recognizing, becoming sensitive, recognizing the differences between pleasant, painful, and neutral, or pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral, and then contemplating the true nature or the nature of these things is also true for perception, which is mentioned a little bit further along in the poem. So we continue on with the poem, and the poem reads, "One does what others will praise and not blame." Those of you who've studied the Metta Sutta with me, and I'm excited that this week we continue on with our looking deeply and practicing with that beautiful discourse, you'll immediately recognize this similar line. And you'll recall that in the Metta Sutta, in the Discourse on Love, that this line means here it is to do what's considered wise by liberated ones, which might seem crazy by the standards of the world or society. So a wise one is not staying by what is seen and heard, but has known perception and has crossed the flood. So there's a sense of, aha, I know you. When we see something or we hear something, we're not going to get caught anymore. Of recognizing the difference between bare experience and story. In fact, there's that beautiful story that I do tell quite often of Bahia, of the bark cloth, who was a wandering ascetic who came to meet the Buddha and then asked the Buddha to teach him the essence of the Dharma, how to transform his suffering and attain liberation. And the Buddha said, well, if you see something, just see it. When you hear something, just hear it. When you taste something, just taste it, and so on. And don't make any therefore. When you make a therefore, there's suffering. If you don't have a therefore, the whole cycle of suffering doesn't have a chance to arise. So this is an invitation for us to look into the difference between bare experience and the interpretations we make about something. And if we're really honest, almost all of our understanding of what we call reality is interpretation. We have in our tradition that beautiful calligraphy of Te, are you sure? And if we ask ourselves as a concrete practice in each and every moment, am I sure that I really understand this situation, this other person fully? Then the answer is always, you don't know. There's always something more to discover. A wise person in the context of this text, in the context of the Book of Eights, has understood the warped nature of our perception, has understood that we don't very often see things so clearly, even though we think that we do. And through that understanding crosses the flood. So with nothing tainted, nothing wrapped around, they fare on in diligence with the arrow removed, neither longing for this world nor for another. Here with nothing tainted means with none of our perceptions tainted, seeing and knowing things as they are, for what they are. And then nothing wrapped around means not covered over with a whole lot of stuff, whether it's physical stuff or ideas or views, but being radically open. We could also see this phrase as a reflection of a phrase that's really early in this particular poem, which is being covered over with unskillfulness. So here we have the counterbalance, being not covered over with unskillfulness. So we continue on our journey against the stream with the arrow removed. The metaphor of the arrow, it represents the deep pain that is actually there, this existential pain that we have when we just keep chasing after the objects of our desire, or the perceptions we have of the objects of our desire, because they can't bring that lasting satisfaction. So there's this sense of deep pain, and it's called the arrow here in this verse. So when we have this understanding, there's no more running after this or that, no more longing for this particular state of existence or that state of existence, just being absolutely at ease wherever we go, which is one of the Dharma seals of the Plum Village practice. So dear family, this verse, this poem, as you can see, is incredibly rich and deep. And I can only offer some very poor pointing out instructions for you to be able to look deeply into this poem, to allow it to become part of your practice, and hopefully to be able to have some helpful insights that will help you along your way. I hope that this evening you've discovered some more aspects to this very beautiful poem, and that parts of this sharing will be useful for you. It's certainly been a delight to be here together with you this evening. So I wish everybody well, and we'll end with 3 sounds of the bell.